I want to tell you a story. The official report lied about a rogue bear. I didn't hear a growl, I heard machine gun fire. They weren't hunting a monster. They were silencing a witness who had mourned our dead for 50 years. And I was the fool who drew the map. You decide who the real monster was. The coffee was perfect that morning. It was 5 in the morning, and the darkness outside my kitchen window in Granite Falls was absolute, save for the reflection of my own tired face in the glass. I am Elias, 74 years old, and I have outlived my wife, my dog, and most of my patients. The rain in the Cascades has a rhythm you learn to ignore, a constant drumming that seeps into the wood of the house and the bones of your hands. I was enjoying the warmth of the ceramic mug, watching the steam curl up toward the yellow ceiling light. It was safe. It was predictable. I had a crossword puzzle waiting on the table, the same one I had started 3 days ago, and a radiator that clanked with a comforting familiarity against the baseboards. I took a sip, savoring the bitterness, thinking about whether I should drive into town for supplies or just stay put and watch the mist roll off the fir trees. The isolation out here is a heavy blanket. Some days it keeps you warm, and other days it threatens to suffocate you. My nearest neighbor is 3 miles down a washout road, and the only conversation I usually get is from the morning news radio. Then, the silence of the morning shattered. It was not a knock. It was a heavy, wet thud against the front door, powerful enough to rattle the frame and send dust drifting down from the lintel. I froze, the coffee trembling in my hand, splashing hot droplets onto my knuckles. No bear hits a door like that. A bear scratches, sniffs, maybe leans. This was an impact, deliberate and singular. No wind throws a log with that kind of precision against a recessed door. My heart did a stutter step in my chest, a feeling I had not had since my days working the search lines in the late 90s. I set the mug down on the Formica counter with a clatter, the sound too loud in the sudden quiet that followed the impact. I grabbed the heavy Maglite flashlight from the counter, the metal cold against my palm, and walked into the hallway. The floorboards creaked under my slippers, betraying my position to whatever was outside. I told myself it was just a branch, just the wind, but the air in the hallway felt charged, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. I unlocked the deadbolt with stiff fingers, the metal tumbling with a sharp click that echoed through the house. I took a breath. I gripped the flashlight like a club and swung the door open. The porch light flickered once and then stabilized, casting a dull amber cone into the gloom. It revealed nothing but the empty gravel driveway and the swaying hemlocks at the edge of the property, their branches dripping like weeping willows in the gray dawn. There was no retreating shadow, no sound of a getaway vehicle, not even the snap of a twig. But there, right on the welcome mat, sitting perfectly upright in a puddle of rainwater, was a bright pink child's backpack. It was a jarring splash of color against the monochromatic world of mud and bark. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped out, and the cold mist instantly clinging to my face. The backpack was small, meant for a girl no older than 7 or 8, with a cartoon unicorn stitched onto the front pocket. But the detail that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up was not the color. It was the fact that the canvas was dry. In a storm that had been raging for 12 hours, turning my yard into a swamp, this bag was bone dry. The zippers were carefully closed, the straps untwisted. It sat there, completely out of place. an impossible artifact delivered by a ghost. I looked out into the wall of black trees, the beam of my flashlight dying in the dense foliage, and I knew with a sinking certainty that the woods were looking back at me. I knew that backpack. Not this specific item, of course, but I knew the taxonomy of the object intimately. It was a kind of cheap, mass-produced nylon tragedy that you see flashing across the bottom of the news tickers on cable television, usually accompanied by a grainy school photograph and the tear-streaked face of a parent pleading into a microphone. It was a symbol of a suburban life interrupted, a bright pink artifact of innocence that had no business resting on a muddy porch in the deep timber of Washington state. I brought it inside, holding it by the top loop as if it might detonate, my heart hammering a rhythm against my ribs that felt dangerous for a man of my age. The adrenaline was a cold flush in my veins, warring with the arthritis in my hands as I set it down on the kitchen table. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the cartoon unicorn embroidered on the front pocket. I stared at it for a long minute, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for a siren, waiting for logic to reassert itself. When I finally worked up the nerve to pull the zipper, the sound was a harsh rasp in the quiet kitchen. I expected the mundane debris of childhood, a crushed juice box, a half-finished homework assignment, maybe a name tag. But the main compartment was empty of human clutter. There was no lunchbox. There were no textbooks. Instead, lying at the bottom like religious relics, were two objects. The first was a single, perfectly preserved raven feather, its black veins shimmering with an iridescent blue sheen under the kitchen light. The second was a smooth river stone, polished to a perfect oval, dark gray and cool to the touch. These were not accidental debris that had fallen in. They were placed there. It was a cache, a message. I zipped the bag shut and went back out to the porch, leaving the door wide open behind me. The rain usually washes everything away in minutes up here in the foothills. The soil is loose and the water is relentless. But the overhang of the porch roof had protected the evidence on the welcome mat and the immediate mud beyond the stairs. I clicked the heavy flashlight back on, aiming the beam at the ground where the gravel driveway met the soft, loam soil of the yard. There were no boot prints. I have spent 40 years looking at vibram soles, heel strikes, and the chaotic scuffs of lost hikers. These were not boots. There were impressions, massive, wide depressions in the soft earth that did not look like feet so much as heavy weights dropped from the sky. They sank 2 inches deep into the soil, where my own boots barely made a mark. The shape was indistinct, a broad oval with no clear arch, but the sheer surface area was terrifying. I followed the line of them with the beam of light. They did not lead up the driveway toward the county road. They did not suggest a visitor who had parked a car and walked up to the house. They led straight back, away from civilization, cutting a dark path through the dense salal and sword ferns, heading directly toward the forbidden, mist-choked ridges of the Pilchuck area. I stood there for a long time, the rain drumming against the hood of the porch, soaking into my socks. A rational man would have gone inside, locked the door, and culled her. But the sheriff was 40 minutes away on a good day, and the rain was washing the world clean with every passing second. I went to the mudroom and began the ritual of layering up, my movements mechanical and practiced. I pulled on my wool socks, the thick gray ones that itch but keep the heat in, and laced up my heavy leather boots. I took the yellow rain slicker off its hook, the material stiff with age and smelling of old rubber and wood smoke. It crackled as I shoved my arms into the sleeves. I told myself, repeating the lie in a whisper, that I was going to look for a bear or a cougar. I told myself I was going out there to scare off a predator that had gotten too curious about the garbage cans. I grabbed my walking stick, a piece of seasoned hickory I had carried since 1995, and clipped a can of bear spray to my belt. But deep down, beneath the layers of denial I had built up over a lifetime of rational thinking, I knew the stride length was wrong for a bear. It was too long. It was too deliberate. A bear ambles. It meanders. These tracks moved with a terrifying purpose. I stepped off the porch and into the deluge. The forest canopy overhead filtered the morning light into a gloom of grays and greens, the world reduced to the immediate radius of my vision. I found the first track easily. It had crushed a fern flat, driving the fronds deep into the mud. I stepped over it, gauging the distance to the next one. 5 feet, maybe more. I had to stretch my legs to match the gait, and I am a man of 6 feet. I followed the track for a mile, the terrain shifting from the flat yard to the rising slope of the foothills. The undergrowth here was thick, a tangle of devil's club and huckleberry bushes that snagged at my slicker, but the maker of the tracks had moved through it like a bulldozer. Branches were not just pushed aside, they were snapped. The air grew heavier the further I climbed, the fresh scent of rain giving way to something more pungent. It was a smell I had encountered only once or twice in my career, usually dismissed as a trick of the wind. It was the smell of ozone, sharp and metallic, layered over the heavy, musky stench of a wet dog that has rolled in something dead. It became almost choking, a physical weight in my lungs that made me want to gag, but I pressed on. The tracks were not running away. That was the realization that made my hands shake as I gripped my walking stick. A fleeing animal crashes. It slips. It leaves chaotic sign. These tracks were measured. They paused. They were waiting. Every 100 yards or so, I would find another marker, another piece of the conversation. The first was a hemlock branch, thick as my wrist, snapped cleanly and left hanging. I reached up to touch the break. It was 7 feet off the ground. No deer rubs antlers that high. No man reaches up to break a green limb just for the sake of it. The break was twisted. The fibers exploded outward, indicating immense torque. I walked on, my breath rasping in my chest, the silence of the woods pressing in on me. The birds had gone silent. The squirrels were gone. There was only the rain and the sound of my own heart. Another quarter-mile up, where the trees began to thin into the rocky scree of the lower slopes, I found the second marker. It was a massive old stump, a remnant of the logging days from the 1920s, rot softened and covered in moss. Sitting squarely in the center of the stump was a pile of huckleberries. They were out of season, or at least they should have been scarce this high up, but here was a handful, fresh and dark blue, piled with delicate precision. They were not scattered, they were stacked. I stopped, staring at the berries, feeling the absurdity of the moment. I was an old man in a yellow coat, standing in the pouring rain, staring at fruit left by a monster. It was not a hunt. I realized then, with a clarity that was colder than the rain running down my neck, a hunt involves stealth. A hunt involves evasion. This was neither. This was a trail of breadcrumbs. It was an invitation. And as I looked up from the stump toward the gray wall of mist that hid the upper peaks, I knew that the host of this gathering was watching me, waiting to see if I had the courage to accept. The climb burned my lungs with a fire that felt entirely separate from the cold dampness of the air. By the time I reached the scree field below the old mining claim, my knees were screaming in protest, the joints grinding together with a sensation like mortar and pestle. This was a part of the mountain that locals usually avoided, a scar left over from the copper boom of 1922, where the earth had been turned inside out and left to rot. The ground here was treacherous, a shifting mosaic of slate and loose gravel that clattered away under my boots, sending miniature avalanches tumbling down into the fog below. The mist was thick here, swirling like milk in water, a living, breathing entity that erased the world beyond a 10-foot radius. It obscured the drop-offs that could kill a careless hiker in a heartbeat, hiding the sheer cliffs where the mountain simply gave up and fell away into the dark valleys of the Pilchuck drainage. I stopped to catch my breath, leaking heavily against the trunk of a dripping cedar that clung to the edge of the slope like a desperate man. My chest heaved, and I could hear the wheezing rattle of my own breath, a harsh mechanical sound against the soft, muffled backdrop of the cloud layer. I wiped rain from my eyes, my hand shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline, and tried to orient myself. That is when the forest went silent. It did not happen gradually. It was as if someone had thrown a heavy breaker switch and cut the power to the world. The steady drip of water from the canopy ceased to register. The distant, lonely call of a raven that had been following me up the ridge was cut off mid-croak. The wind, which had been moaning through the jagged rocks of the mine tailings, died instantly. The air grew heavy and static, pressing against my eardrums with a physical weight. In that vacuum of sound, my own heartbeat became a deafening drum, thudding against my ribs. I gripped my hickory walking stick until my knuckles turned white, my instincts screaming that I was no longer the hunter, nor the observer, but the observed. I scanned the gray curtain of mist, looking for movement, looking for the bear I had lied to myself about. Then, a shape detached itself from the tree line. It did not emerge from the trees. It separated from them, as if the bark and the shadows had simply decided to coalesce into a solid form. It was huge, a vertical mass of darkness that defied the scale of the surrounding timber. It stood on two legs, it towering well over 7 feet. It covered in fur the color of wet ash and old bark, a natural ghillie suit that made it nearly invisible against the gloom of the storm. I stopped breathing. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation, a man in a suit, a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by altitude and age, but the reality of it was too visceral to deny. It stood maybe 40 feet away and watching me. It did not roar. It did not charge. It did not bare its teeth in a display of dominance. It simply stood there, an anchor in the shifting fog. I locked eyes with it, and that was the moment my terror shifted into something else, something profound and unsettling. Its eyes were not the reflective, predatory orbs of a cougar or a bear. They were shockingly human, dark and intelligent, framed by a heavy, protruding brow ridge that cast them in shadow. They were ancient eyes, filled with a depth of cognition that unsettled me more than any growl could have. I saw the rain beating on its thick coat, the way its chest rose and fell in a slow, controlled rhythm. It took a slow step forward, the movement heavy and deliberate, and I saw the muscles ripple under that thick coat, a testament to raw, prehistoric power that could snap my spine like a dry twig. I braced myself, tightening my grip on the bear spray canister on my belt, though I knew it would be as effective as a water pistol against a freight train. But it did not attack. As it moved into better light, I saw that its posture was slumped, almost weary. The shoulders, massive enough to span a doorway, were hunched forward, not in aggression, but in a gesture that looked painfully like defeat. It was holding something in its right hand, cradling it against its massive chest with a delicacy that contradicted its size. It extended a long arm, the limb thick with muscle and covered in dark hair, palm up. Resting in the center of a hand that was twice the size of my own was a smartphone. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures catching the gray light, and the pink plastic case was covered in smears of mud. The sight of such a modern, trivial object in the grasp of a myth was jarring, a collision of worlds that my brain refused to process. The creature rumbled, a sound that did not come from a throat but seemed to originate from the earth itself. It vibrated in my chest cavity, low and mournful, like a cello played in a deep tunnel. It was a vocalization of pure sorrow, a frequency of loss that transcended species. It was not aggression. It was grief. It was a plea. The creature looked from the phone to me, then back to the phone, its expression shifting with a nuance I never thought possible in an animal. It stepped closer, invading my personal space, and the smell hit me again. The ozone, the wet musk, the scent of old stone. But there was no malice in the odor, only the wild, unfiltered scent of existence. It reached out and placed the phone on a flat slate rock that sat between us, setting it down with the precision of a jeweler. Then it backed away with a fluidity that should not be possible for something of that size and weight, melting back toward the tree line without breaking a single twig. It paused at the edge of the mist and raised that long arm again. A thick, dark finger uncurled and pointed up, past the mining tailings, toward a section of the cliff face I had scanned a dozen times before. Following the line of its gesture, and I saw it. A narrow fissure in the rock face, hidden behind a screen of hanging moss and hemlock roots. A darkness within the darkness that I had never noticed before. The creature made that low, chuffing sound again, a sound of urging, before it stepped backward into the fog and vanished as completely as smoke in a gale, leaving me alone with the silence, the rain, and the cracked phone of a stranger resting on the stone altar between us. I stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into my bones, realizing that the boundary between the world I knew and the world I was walking into had just been irrevocably erased. The monster on the mountain was not hiding from me. It was leading me, and the weight of that trust felt heavier than the pack on my shoulders. I should have turned back. Any sane man, any man with a shred of self-preservation left in his withered soul, would have turned around and run down that scree slope until his heart burst or his legs gave out. The survival instinct is a powerful thing. A reptilian voice in the base of the skull that screams at you to flee from the unknown, especially when the unknown stands 7 feet tall and smells of wet fur and ancient earth. But the look in those eyes held me fast. It was not a predatory gaze. It was a look of desperate, crushing loneliness. The kind I see in the mirror every morning when I brush my teeth in an empty house. It was a look that said, "Witness this," and I found that I could not refuse. I tightened my grip on the hickory walking stick, not as a weapon anymore, but as a crutch for my trembling knees, and I began to climb. The fissure the creature had pointed to was higher up, a jagged, vertical wound in the basalt face of the cliff, hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss and the twisted roots of a hemlock tree that clung to the rock for dear life. The climb was short but brutal, a scramble over slick, wet stone where a single slip would mean a tumble back down into the jagged mine tailings. I hauled myself up, gasping for air, the rain plastering my thinning hair to my skull, and squeezed through the opening. The transition was immediate and disorienting. One moment I was in the deafening roar of the storm, the wind howling through the valley and the rain hammering against my slicker. The next, I was in a silence so profound it felt like pressure in my ears. The fissure opened into a dry, shallow cave, a natural amphitheater carved out of the mountain by water and time eons ago. It was shielded from the weather by the overhang of the cliff, a dry pocket in a drowning world. The air inside was still and cool, but it was the smell that hit me first, a physical wall of scent that made my head swim. It was intense, a heavy, cloying mixture of musk, pine resin, and damp earth. But underneath those natural odors was the distinct, sharp chemical scent of old canvas, degrading plastic, and treated leather. It smelled like the attic of a surplus store, or the lost and found box at a forgotten elementary school, amplified 1,000 times. I stood there in the gloom, my eyes adjusting to the lack of gray daylight, and reached for the heavy mag light on my belt. My thumb found the rubberized switch, and I clicked it on. The beam cut through the gloom like a lightsaber, a solid bar of white light in the dusty air. I swept it across the floor, expecting to see a den of horrors. My imagination, fueled by decades of search and rescue horror stories and the primal fear of the dark, had painted a picture of gnawed bones, scattered remains, and the gory trophies of a man-eater. I braced myself for the sight of skulls and rib cages, but as the light washed over the back wall of the cave, the breath left my lungs in a long, shuddering sigh. It was not a den of bones. It was a library. Along the walls, utilizing the natural shelving of the layered basalt rock, were items. Hundreds of them. They were not thrown in a pile. They were not scattered in the chaotic disarray of a scavenger's nest. They were arranged. They were curated. I stepped forward, my boots crunching softly on the dry dust of the cave floor, and began to pan the light slowly across the collection. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. On the lowest shelf, just knee-high, were wallets. There must have been 50 of them, arranged by color, black leather in one row, brown in another, Velcro nylon wallets in a third. Next to them were eyeglasses and sunglasses, folded neatly with the stems crossed, the lenses wiping clean of dust, staring back at me like the eyes of the missing. I moved the light higher. Cameras. Old film cameras from the 1970s and 80s, their metal bodies tarnished but intact. Disposable Kodak cameras that had never been developed. Bulky digital cameras from the early 2000s. They sat in a row, chronologically arranged by technology, a museum of captured memories that no one would ever see. There were GPS units, their batteries long dead, compasses with cracked faces, and water bottles of every make and model, from old metal canteens to modern Nalgene bottles, standing upright like soldiers in formation. And then there were the backpacks, rows upon rows of them, stacked against the far wall where the cave ceiling dipped low. They were the most haunting of all. Faded Kelty packs from the 1980s with their external aluminum frames. Bright neon day packs from the 90s. Modern ultralight gear from just last season. They were not torn apart. They were not bloodied. They were preserved. Some still had sleeping pads strapped to the outside. Others had carabiners clipping mugs to the straps. They looked like they were waiting for their owners to finish a break and shoulder them again. The colors were muted by the layer of cave dust. But under my light, I could see the reds, the blues, the forest greens. The colors we tell hikers to wear so they can be seen from the air. Here, in the dark, they were finally visible. A movement at the entrance of the cave made me spin around, the flashlight beam jerking wildly. The creature had followed me in. It had to stoop to fit through the fissure, and its massive shoulders scraping the rock. But once inside, it rose to its full height. In the confined space of the cave, it was impossibly large, a towering wall of fur and muscle that blocked out the gray light from the outside world. But strangely, I did not feel the urge to run anymore. Its presence blocked the wind and the cold, offering a strange, terrifying comfort. It stood near the entrance, its back to the storm, watching me with those deep, sorrowful eyes. It did not move to stop me. It simply watched, like a museum curator observing a visitor in a restricted wing. I turned back to the shelves, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch a leather wallet on the second tier. The leather was dry and brittle, cracking slightly under my thumb. I opened it. The plastic windows of the photo insert were yellowed with age, but the faces behind them were still smiling. A young woman in a sundress, a golden retriever, and a baby with a cake-smeared face. I pulled out the driver's license. The laminate was peeling, but the name was clear. It belonged to a man named David, a hiker I remembered searching for in the late summer of 1998. I remembered the search vividly. We had combed the North Ridge for 2 weeks, calling his name until our voices were raw. We had found his car at the trailhead, but never a trace of the man. And here was his wallet, resting on a shelf in a cave that was not on any map, guarded by a myth. I looked at the creature, holding the wallet up in the beam of my light. "You found him," I whispered, my voice cracking in the dry air. "You did not kill him. You found him." The creature made a series of soft chuffing sounds, a rhythmic exhalation of air through its nose. It stepped closer, the smell of musk intensifying, and tapped its own massive chest with a wide, flat hand. Then, it pointed a long, dark finger at the items on the wall. It moved its hand through the air in a slow arc, tracing the path of the sun, and then pointed to the items again. It was trying to tell me time. It was trying to tell me history. Then, it did something that broke my heart. It pointed to the sky, to the invisible ceiling of the cave, and then brought its hands down rapidly, miming a fall. It slapped its hands against its thighs, a sharp sound in the quiet cave. Then it wrapped its massive arms around itself, hugging its own torso, and began to shiver. It was a pantomime,
a game of charades played by a beast to explain the fate of the ghosts surrounding us.
The message was clear, transcending language and species. It was telling me they fell. They froze. The mountain took them. It walked over to a section of the wall where a collection of heavy wool coats and fleece jackets were folded with military precision. It touched one gently, running a finger over the fabric. Then it looked back at me, its eyes wide and glistening in the reflected light of my torch. It mimed the shivering again, then pointed to the coats, and then made a sweeping gesture of helplessness. It had tried to help? Or perhaps it had found them when they were already cold, already gone, and taken their second skins because it understood, on some primal level, that the cold was the enemy. I realized then the magnitude of what I was seeing. These were not trophies. A predator keeps trophies to celebrate the kill. A serial killer keeps tokens to relive the power. This was a memorial. These were not victims of a monster. They were victims of the mountain, of the sudden storms that roll in off the Pacific, of the loose shale that gives way under a boot, of the hypothermia that sets in when you twist an ankle 10 miles from the nearest road. This being had not killed them. It had found them. It had found them, broken at the bottom of ravines, or curled up in the snow in a final sleep, or lost in the dense timber where the search dogs lost the scent. And in its own way, it had mourned them. It had gathered their things, the shells of their lives, and carried them here to this dry, safe place. It had organized them, cared for them, kept vigil over them. Why? I did not know. Maybe because it was lonely. Maybe because it saw us as cousins. Strange, hairless, fragile cousins who came into its home and died too easily. Maybe it was trying to make sense of the tragedy, just like we do. It was not a monster haunting the woods. It was the custodian of the lost. I looked at the rows of backpacks again, and this time I did not see a pile of discarded gear. I saw a choir. I saw the thousands of miles walked, the summits reached, the sunsets watched, all represented by the nylon and straps left behind. I saw the humanity in the organization, the way a child's toy was placed next to a parent's hiking pole, and the way the ID cards were placed face up. The creature let out a low, rumbling groan, a sound of such profound weariness that it made my own old bones ache in sympathy. It sat down heavily on a large flat stone near the entrance, its knees drawn up, its head bowing. It looked at me, then at the collection, and then closed its eyes for a moment. It was tired. It was so incredibly tired of carrying the weight of all these dead strangers. And for the first time in 40 years, the mystery of the missing hikers of the Cascades made sense. They had not vanished into thin air. They had been collected, cared for, and remembered by the only thing in these woods that truly understood what it meant to be alone. I lowered my flashlight, letting the beam rest on the floor, and in the dim light, I nodded to the guardian. "I understand," I said softly. "I see them." And for a moment, in the silence of the cave, I felt a strange, impossible kinship with the beast in the shadows. We were both old. We were both tired, and we were both the only ones left who remembered the names of the dead. I spent an hour in that stone cathedral of the lost, a period of time that felt simultaneously like a heartbeat and a century. The storm outside continued to rage, a distant and muffled drumming against the mountain, but inside the fissure, time seemed to have pooled and stagnated, thick with the weight of memory. The creature, whom I had started calling the guardian in the quiet privacy of my own mind, did not leave my side. It was no longer the imposing shadow of the forest or the terrifying beast of local legend. It had transformed into a desperate, weary curator showing a visitor the ruins of a civilization that only it remembered. It moved with a shuffling, heavy grace, the sound of its breathing, a wet, rattling inhalation filling the silence between us. It showed me specific things, choosing them with a deliberation that suggested it had spent years thinking about this moment, rehearsing this handover in the solitude of the cave. It reached up to a high shelf, its massive shoulder muscles rolling under the gray fur, and brought down a small, silver object. It was a digital camera, a bulky point-and-shoot model from around 2010, the kind with the sliding lens cover that had been ubiquitous before smartphones took over the world. The guardian held it out to me, resting it on a palm that was leathery and wide as a dinner plate. I hesitated, then reached out and took it. The metal was cold, leaching the warmth from my fingers. I turned it over in my hands. The battery was dead, obviously, the screen black and lifeless, but I popped the side latch and pressed the small spring-loaded card. The memory card clicked and popped out, pristine and intact. I looked up at the creature. It was watching my hands intently, its head cocked to the side. When it saw that I understood the significance of the card, that I recognized the potential of the images trapped inside, it let out a soft, low rumble that vibrated through the floor and up into the soles of my boots. It was a sound of approval. It wanted these photos seen. It wanted the last sunsets, the blurry selfies, the pictures of campfires and friends to be released from this stone purgatory. It turned back to the wall and selected another item, this one treated with even more reverence. It was a notebook, a standard composition book with a black and white marbled cover, but it had been wrapped in 3 distinct layers of gallon-sized Ziploc bags. The plastic was yellowed and brittle with age, but the seal had held. The guardian pressed it into my chest, forcing me to take it with both hands. Through the cloudy plastic, I could see handwriting on the cover, a name written in permanent marker that had not faded. The creature tapped the book and then pointed to its own temple, and then made a gesture of opening a book and reading. It was desperate for me to understand. This was not just identification. This was a voice. This was the internal monologue of someone who had died waiting for rescue, preserved against the rot and the damp by a creature that supposedly did not have a soul. The guardian made eye contact with me then, and the intensity of it almost made me step back. Its eyes were a deep, liquid amber, rimmed with the red of exhaustion, and they held a depth of sorrow that was crushing. It turned and walked to the lip of the cave entrance, where the gray light of the storm filtered in. It raised a long, dark arm and gestured sweepingly toward the valley below, toward the invisible grid of the logging roads and the distant, unseen lights of the town of Granite Falls. It pointed to the town, then back to the pile of artifacts, then back to the town again. The pantomime was crude but devastatingly effective. It wanted these things returned.
It wanted the families to know. It was tired, so incredibly tired, of holding the weight of all this sorrow alone.
It was a pallbearer who had been carrying the casket for decades, waiting for someone, anyone, to come and help shoulder the load. I realized then, standing in the dust of that tomb with a dead man's journal in my hands, that the stories were all wrong. The campfire tales, the horror movies, the hysterical reports on the radio, they were all lies born of our own primal insecurity. We painted them as monsters because we fear the woods, and because we need a face to put on the indifferent cruelty of nature. We need a beast to blame for the fall, and for the freeze, and for the darkness. But this thing, this towering, smelling, wild thing, was more human than us. We bomb our history. We pave over our cemeteries. We forget our dead in the rush of the news cycle. But this creature felt empathy. It understood the tragedy of a life cut short. It understood that a mother in Ohio was still waiting to know what happened to her son in 1999. It understood that a daughter in Seattle still looked at the door every Christmas, hoping her father would walk through. It had gathered the pieces of those broken lives and kept them safe, waiting for a witness. I set the journal down on a flat rock and took off my own backpack. It was a modern thing, lightweight and waterproof, filled with my survival gear, a thermos of coffee, a first aid kit, extra wool socks, a bag of trail mix. I emptied it all out. I dumped the coffee on the dusty floor, the dark liquid pooling and sinking into the dry earth. I tossed the trail mix into the corner. I did not need food. I did not need comfort. I needed space. I began to pack. I started with the wallets, stacking them like bricks in the bottom of my bag. I packed the digital cameras, the GPS units, the small, hard items that held the most data. I packed the Ziploc-wrapped journal, sliding it carefully against the back panel so it would not bend. I packed a small stuffed bear that had been sitting on top of a blue JanSport pack. I packed a set of car keys with a Toyota fob. I packed until the zippers strained and the seams groaned. My pack, which had weighed 20 pounds on the way up, now weighed 50. It was heavy, dense with the physical mass of plastic and metal, but heavier still with the spiritual density of the cargo. I was carrying the final answers for dozens of families. I was carrying the closure of a generation of missing persons cases. The Guardian watched me pack, standing just out of the way, its hands hanging loosely by its sides. When I zipped the bag shut and hauled it onto my shoulders, grunting under the weight, the creature stepped forward and reached out a hand, hovering it near my shoulder for a moment before pulling back. It was a gesture of restraint, a desire to help or perhaps to thank, checked by the knowledge of what it was and what I was. I adjusted the straps, the nylon digging into my shoulders, and looked up at the giant. We stood there for a long moment, two old males from two different worlds, united by the dead. "I will take them," I said, my voice sounding thin and scratchy in the cavernous space. I cleared my throat and spoke louder, wanting the stone to record the vow. "I will take them back. I will tell them. I promise you." The Guardian looked at me, and for a second, the heavy brow ridge smoothed, the tension in the jaw relaxed. It let out a long exhale, a sound that was half sigh and half moan, as if a great pressure had been released from its chest. It tapped its heart again, then pointed at me. "You carry it now," it seemed to say.
It is your turn. I turned to the fissure. The descent would be dangerous, especially with the extra weight and the slick rocks, but I felt a strange surge of strength. I was not just hiking out. I was on a mission. I squeezed through the opening, the rain hitting me instantly like a slap in the face, cold and shocking after the stillness of the cave. I found my footing on the wet basalt, the wind tearing at my slicker, and began to pick my way down.
When I reached the bottom of the fissure and stood on the scree slope again, I turned back to look up. The guardian was there. It stood silhouetted against the gray light of the cave entrance, a dark, hulking shape framed by the jagged rock. It was not hiding anymore. It stood tall, its posture upright for the first time since I had met it. It looked like a lonely king in a kingdom of ghosts, watching his envoy depart for the foreign lands of the living.
I raised my hand in a salute, a gesture of respect I usually reserved for veterans. I nodded to it, the water dripping off the brim of my hat. I would not let you down, I whispered into the wind, though I knew it could not hear me over the gale. It did not move. It did not wave. It simply watched me, a dark statue against the gray cliff, a silent sentinel trusting me with its sacred duty. It stayed there as I navigated the treacherous mine tailings. It stayed there as I crossed the swollen creek. Every time I looked back, until the mist finally swallowed the cliff face completely, that dark shape was there, bearing witness to my departure. It was waiting to see if I was worthy of the trust it had placed in me. It was waiting to see if humanity was capable of the same grace it had shown the dead.
As I entered the tree line and the canopy swallowed me, cutting off my view of the high peaks, the weight of the pack on my back felt like it was crushing me into the mud. But it was not the weight of the plastic and the metal that made me stumble. It was the crushing realization of what I had to do next. I had to go back to a world that believed in monsters and tell them that the only monster on the mountain was the indifference of time.
I had to go back to a town that armed itself against the dark and tell them that the dark had been cradling their children. I walked faster, the mud sucking at my boots, fueled by a burning, righteous need to fulfill the promise I had made to the gray guardian of the lost. The storm raged on, washing away my tracks as fast as I made them, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my gut, that I would never be able to wash the memory of those sorrowful amber eyes from my mind. The drive down the mountain was a blur of gray asphalt and windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. I drove my old Ford truck faster than the suspension was designed to handle, the tires hydroplaning over the ruts in the logging road, the heater blasting hot, stale air into the cab to stop my teeth from chattering. The backpack sat on the passenger seat like a passenger, heavy with the souls of the lost, sliding against the door whenever I took a corner too sharp. I was manic, fueled by a cocktail of adrenaline, exhaustion, and a burning, righteous purpose that felt almost religious. I rehearsed my speech in the rearview mirror, my eyes wild and bloodshot. I would tell them everything. I would make them understand. I would force the town of Granite Falls to apologize to the monster they had spent a century fearing. I pulled into the sheriff's station lot. The truck skid ding to a halt across 2 parking spaces. I did not bother to lock it. I grabbed the pack, hoisting the 50 pounds of evidence onto my shoulder, and burst through the double glass doors, dripping water and mud onto the polished linoleum floor. The station was quiet, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee, a sharp, sterile contrast to the musk and pine of the cave. Deputy Miller was at the front desk, a man I had known since he was a varsity linebacker at the high school in 1992. He looked up from his computer, his jaw dropping slightly as he took in my appearance.
the yellow slicker torn at the sleeve, the mud caked to my knees, the frantic energy vibrating off me. I did not give him a chance to speak. I marched up to the high counter and unzipped the bag. I did not just open it. I upended it. I dumped the contents out with a crash that echoed through the lobby.
Wallets, cameras, GPS units, the Ziploc-wrapped journal. They cascaded across the counter, sliding over papers and keyboards. A landslide of memory. Miller stood up, backing away, his hand instinctively dropping to his belt, though not to his gun. Elias? What the hell is this? He stammered, picking up a muddy GPS unit. It's the answer, Frank, I rasped, my voice cracking. It's all of them. Every single one of them.
I grabbed a wallet from the pile, the leather cracked and white with mold residue, and shoved it toward him. Look at the ID. Look at it. Miller opened the wallet. I saw the blood drain from his face, leaving it the color of old parchment. He recognized the name. It was a local boy, a kid who had vanished during a senior skip day in 2004. This is Billy's wallet, he whispered. Where did you find this? Did you find the body? No bodies, I said, leaning over the counter, grabbing his uniform shirt. That's the point, Frank. There are no bodies because nothing ate them. It found them. It found them all, I told him. I vomited the story out in a chaotic, disjointed stream. I told him about the tracks, the breadcrumbs, the climb, the gray sentinel in the mist. I told him about the cave, the library of backpacks, the way the creature had shivered to explain the cold. I told him about the empathy in those amber eyes, the sorrow in that deep, cello-like rumble. It's a rescue, Frank, I pleaded, tears mixing with the rain on my face. It's not a monster. It's a guardian. It wants the families to know. It gave me these. Nilla listened, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow. He looked at the pile of evidence, undeniable and overwhelming. And then he looked at me. He did not call me crazy. He did not laugh. He looked terrified. He picked up the phone, but he did not dial the search and rescue coordinator. He did not dial the mayor. He dialed the number he had written on a yellow sticky note taped to the side of his monitor. A number with an area code I did not recognize. He spoke in low, hushed tones, his back to me, words like asset, confirmation, and location drifting over the counter. When he hung up, he looked pale. Sit down, Elias, he said, his voice trembling. Just sit down. Someone is coming to take a statement. This is above my pay grade. I sat on the hard plastic bench in the lobby, my adrenaline crashing into a deep, bone-weary cold. I thought they were sending the state police. I thought maybe the FBI. I watched the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking away the minutes of my life. 20 minutes later, almost to the second, the vehicles arrived. They were not police cruisers. They were 3 black SUVs, unmarked, with tinted windows and government plates. They pulled up to the curb with aggressive precision, boxing in my truck. Men got out. They were not local search and rescue boys in orange vests. They wore gray tactical gear, no insignias, no name tags, just functional, expensive clothing and heavy boots. They moved with a synchronization that screamed military training. They entered the station, bringing a gust of cold air with them. The lead man, a tall figure with a buzz cut and eyes like flint, walked straight to the counter. He did not look at Miller. He looked at the pile,
He picked up the journal, weighed it in his hand, and nodded to his team. Without a word, they began to sweep the items into black plastic evidence bins they had brought with them. They moved efficiently, treating the sacred artifacts of the dead like contraband. "Hey!" I stood up, my legs shaky. "Be careful with that."
That's evidence. That's for the families. The lead man turned to me. He did not introduce himself.
"You're the one who brought this in?" His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. "Yes," I said, straightening my spine. "I found the cache. I made contact with the entity." "Entity," he repeated, testing the word. He gestured to the back room. "Show us." They took me into the interrogation room. They did not offer me coffee.
They confiscated my phone, demanding the passcode, which I gave them because I thought they needed to see the photos I had taken of the cave entrance. They confiscated the memory cards from my pockets. Then they laid a large, laminated topographic map of the Pilchuck area on the metal table. The lead man smoothed it out, his finger tracing the contour lines. "Point," he said. I hesitated. A sudden, cold knot formed in my stomach. The atmosphere in the room was not one of relief or gratitude. It was predatory. "Why?" I asked. "Are you going to send a recovery team? It's steep. You'll need helicopters. The creature, the guardian, it's still there. You have to be careful not to scare it. It's intelligent." The man looked at me, and for a second, his mask slipped. I saw a flash of contempt, or perhaps pity. "We are the recovery team, Mr. Vance. We specialize in this kind of anomaly. We need to secure the site to ensure the remains are returned to the families." "That is what you want, isn't that it?" "Closure?" He used the magic word, closure. I thought of the weeping mothers on the news. I thought of the guardian's desperate pantomime, begging me to tell the world. I thought I was the bridge between the two species. I thought I was helping. "Yes," I whispered. "That's what it wants, too." "Then show us where it is," he said, pushing a red marker into my hand. "Show us exactly where you entered." I looked at the map. I saw the familiar lines of the ridges, the dip of the valley, the scar of the old mine tailings. My hand shook as I hovered the pen over the paper. I felt a warning bells ringing in the back of my head, a primal instinct screaming at me to keep the secret. But the weight of the logic was too strong. These men were the government. They had the resources. They were the only way the backpack got back to the parents. I lowered the pen. I drew a small X on the cliff face, right above the scree field. "Here," I said. "There's a fissure behind a hemlock root system. It's hidden." The man pulled the map away before the ink was even dry. He nodded to his subordinate, who spoke into a radio on his shoulder. "Target localized. Sector 4. Prepare the package." They escorted me out of the station. They did not thank me. They did not ask me to sign a statement. They simply walked me to my truck and told me to go home. "We will handle the remains recovery from here, Mr. Vance," the lead man said, standing in the rain. "Do not speak to the press. Do not go back up the mountain. It is an active crime scene now. Go home." I drove home in a daze. The adrenaline had burned out, leaving me hollow. I sat on my porch that night,
the rain finally tapering off into a cold mist.
I did not turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, watching the silhouette of the ridge against the charcoal sky. I was waiting for the news report. I was waiting for the breaking news interrupt, announcing the discovery of the century, the vindication of the Sasquatch legend, the return of the lost children. I imagined the guardian being tranquilized, maybe, and studied, or perhaps protected in a sanctuary. I imagined the families crying tears of relief. Midnight came and went. The house settled around me, the wood creaking. And then, around 12:30 in the morning, I heard it. It was not a knock. It was not the wind. It was a sound I recognized from my time in the service, a sound that does not belong in the quiet woods of the Pacific Northwest. Thump, thump, thump. The rhythmic, heavy bass of a .50 caliber automatic weapon echoing off the canyon walls. It was distinct, mechanical, ruthless. It was not warning shots. It was suppression fire. It lasted for maybe 10 seconds, a tearing sound that ripped through the night air and shredded the silence. I stood up, gripping the porch railing, my heart stopping. "No," I whispered. "No." Then came the silence, a heavy, pregnant silence that lasted for a full minute. I held my breath, praying that I was wrong, praying that it was thunder, praying that the guardian had slipped away into the mist like smoke. Then the ground shook. A dull, booming explosion rolled down from the mountain, deep enough to rattle the windows in their frames and knock a flower pot off the railing. It was not a sharp crack like dynamite. It was a deep, heaving thud, the sound of geology being violently rearranged. It was the sound of a cave collapsing, the sound of a tomb being sealed. I fell back into the chair, gasping for air, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. They had not gone up there to recover the backpacks. They had not gone up there to interview the witness. They had gone up there to erase it. I sat there until dawn, unable to move, unable to cry. When the sun finally turned the gray clouds to a bruised purple, I went inside and turned on the radio. The local news was already running the story. "Authorities have triggered a controlled avalanche in the Pilchuck mining area early this morning," the announcer said, his voice cheerful and oblivious. The measure was taken to prevent a catastrophic mudslide after the heavy rains. In related news, Fish and Wildlife officers have reported that a rogue bear, responsible for aggressive behavior in the area, was put down during the operation. The Forest Service has closed the access road indefinitely for stability checks. I looked out the kitchen window. I poured my coffee, my hands shaking so bad the liquid slopped over the rim. Far up on the ridge, a thin column of dark smoke was rising into the cold morning air, marking the spot where the fissure used to be. It was not just dust from a rock slide. It was smoke. They were burning it. They were burning the backpacks. They were burning the journals. They were burning the body. I took a sip of the coffee, but it tasted like ash. I looked at the smoke, twisting and curling toward the heavens, and I realized the full extent of my crime. The creature had trusted me. It had stepped out of the shadows for the first time in history because it believed that we, were capable of understanding its grief.
It had handed me the legacy of the lost, believing I was a messenger of truth. And I had taken that trust, wrapped it in a map, and handed it directly to the executioners. I had not saved the truth.
I had not brought closure to the families. I had led the death squad right to the front door of the only innocent soul in these mountains. The silence of the house was absolute now, but in my head, I could still hear the 3 knocks, echoing forever in a room that no longer existed.